So Kreeft gives you 6 rules for assessing the validity of syllogisms. I'm going to reduce it to 4. There are really only 4 rules you need to know. I think his first and second rules are really just part of the definition of a syllogism. If it doesn't have 3 terms, if it doesn't have 3 claims, it's not actually a syllogism at all, so there's no point in asking whether it's a valid syllogism. So I'm going to put those at the earlier stage of, are we actually in the presence of a syllogism? If we have 4 terms, if we have 4 claims, or 2 terms or 2 claims, we simply don't have a syllogism at all, much less an invalid one. Right? So I'm going to focus in on the other rules, and I'm going to call those rules 1 through 4. So I'm going to use a different pattern, a different set of numbering from Kreeft. We'll present those rules pretty consistently. I will let you, in doing exercises and homework, just refer to the rules by number, provided that you're applying them correctly and I know that you understand them. Okay. It would also be good to learn the names of the rules, and of course, you have to be able to apply them by content. So we have a syllogism. We've got the syllogism in standard form. We're able to evaluate it. We have 4 rules for evaluating its validity. 2 of them are connected with the distribution of the terms, which is why we've covered distribution previously. The other 2 rules are connected with negativity. And part of the overall pattern is that we can't have the conclusion trying to do more than the premises justify. We can't have an affirmative conclusion based upon negative premises. We can't have a distributed claim in the conclusion based upon an undistributed claim in the premises. That's your sort of overall rule. I compared it before to depositing and withdrawing money from a bank account. Okay, the premises make the deposit, the conclusion writes the check. As long as there's enough money in the bank to cover the check, everything goes fine. Your trouble is when your conclusion overdraws the information contained in the premises. That's when you have an invalid syllogism. So we just go through the rules one by one? All right, let's do it. First rule. The middle term must be distributed at least once. If you don't have the middle term distributed by either premise, then you don't have a valid syllogism. Failure to do this is called the fallacy of the undistributed middle. And it's common intellectual error. Why is a syllogism with an undistributed middle term invalid? Let's think about what distribution means. If a term is distributed, then what is the proposition doing to it? Remember the definition of distribution? Yes?
Defining the entirety of.
It's making a claim about the entirety of the term. So I need to have at least one premise that makes a claim about the entirety of the M term, which is the middle term, the bridge between the subject and predicate terms. The difficulty, as we'll see, is that if I don't have a distributed middle term, then I don't have confidence that what I've said about the subject matches up with what I'm saying about the predicate. Most common kind of undistributed middle term is going to be a AAA syllogism in the second figure with both of the middle terms in the predicate slot. Let's take a look at that. Format, all P or M, all S or M, therefore all S or P. We notice this doesn't follow. And the reason it doesn't follow is, who can explain it to me just colloquially? Why doesn't it follow from these 2 claims? Before I give an example with S, M, and P filled in. Why not?
There could be some things that are not M that are also not S or P.
Right, okay, so there could be, well, specifically here, this claims that every S is P. And the question is, the S's that are M might not be the same as the P's that are M. You see the gap that's being left here between these premises? Let's give another example. Okay, I'll fill in the terms this time. Okay, all priests are men, all cowboys are men. Even if those things were both true, it wouldn't necessarily prove. It'd actually be a good premise for like a sci-fi novel. All cowboys are priests. Okay. It simply doesn't follow from these 2 things being true. Why? Because the fact that all cowboys are men and all priests are men does not indicate that they all belong to the same group. Okay. This is common. Notice what this is. This is a AAA1 syllogism with the first premise converted. AAA1 always works. AAA1 is valid. this, if somebody makes the mistake of illicitly converting this major premise, then we have an undistributed middle term. There's not enough information about men in this syllogism to justify this conclusion, because the men who are cowboys and the men who are priests are not the same men. Undistributed middle term. Questions about that? Need for another example? Yeah. So this is easily recognizable it's easily applicable as a rule. All you need to do is to go through your 3 claims, circle all the distributed terms. This is just get a habit to get into when you're looking at any syllogism. Just circle any term that is distributed. So you come across, in this case, I'd circle P, I'd circle S. Why? Because A claims distribute their subjects. S is also distributed down here. But because A claims don't distribute their predicates, I don't circle any of the M's. I look, I see that no M is circled. I have a rule 1 violation. Something important to note also, it's okay to have the middle term distributed twice. That's having more money in the bank than you absolutely require. There's not a problem with that. It's just a matter of the premises have to make at least a single distributed claim about the middle term. Let's talk about rule 2. Rule 2 also deals with distribution, but in a little bit more complex way. Evaluating it's going to take a little bit more work. The second rule, any term distributed in the conclusion must be distributed in the premise that contains it. Now, the conclusion contains 2 terms, the major and minor. So again, as with the naming of the terms, it's the conclusion that governs the whole syllogism. If the conclusion makes a distributed claim, one of the premises has to have made that deposit in the bank of a distributed claim about that particular term in order to justify that claim. If we don't have the premise distributing the term that's distributed by the conclusion, we have an invalid syllogism. The fallacy here is called the fallacy of illicit major or illicit minor, depending upon whether it's the major or the minor term that's affected in this case. So, first thing I want you to see, well, sorry, other observation about this, the structure of this rule is not symmetrical. Things distributed by the conclusion need not be distributed by the, terms distributed by the premise do not have to be distributed in the conclusion, just like you don't have to draw down your entire bank balance with every check. So the asymmetry here, keep in mind, it's that the premises have to cover the checks written by the conclusion, not the other way around. So don't make the mistake of applying rule 2 and trying to find a rule 2 violation where there's a distributed claim in the premise that's not paralleled in the conclusion. It's the opposite problem you want to worry about here. It's that the conclusion is making a greater distributed claim than the premise is about the term in question. So why is this a violation? Again, with distribution. Distribution involves making a claim about the entirety of a class of objects. If the conclusion makes a claim about the entirety of a class of objects, but the premise does not, then our premises are not providing information sufficient to justify the conclusion. So let's take an example. All priests are men. Which term is distributed here? Priests, the minor term. So if I were to write a minor premise that doesn't distribute priests, so I'm just feeling kind of goofy today. So suppose I write all men are cowboys, all cowboys are priests, all priests are men. What's the mood and figure here? It's AAA. 4. So what terms are distributed here? The subject terms of the premises. So what do I have? What do I have now? I have a situation in which cowboys is my middle term. It is distributed, so there's no rule 1 violation. That's good. I know enough about cowboys to pay off this conclusion. But I have a distributed claim being made about priests. All priests, every last one of them, is a man. That happens to be true, but for the time being, we'll bracket that. But I don't have a distributed claim about priests my minor premise. I'm not told that only cowboys are priests. My problem here is that not enough information about priests contained in the premise to justify the conclusion. Maybe here actually making it be about priests gets in the way, because we know facts. We know that these two premises are false. This conclusion is true. But you see the Rule 2 violation here. Yeah. Okay. If I were to substitute this, right, all the AAA4 looks like all P or M, all M or S, all S or P. This doesn't work because there's a Rule 2 violation, even though there's not a Rule 1 violation. So in this case, it's fallacy of illicit minor. The minor term is distributed by the conclusion, but not by the minor premise. You guys want more practice with this, or shall I go on to Rules 3 and 4? Okay. If you don't see this initially, you may not see it intuitively in every case, but practicing with it, you get to see the structure involved at the very least. Any AAA4 syllogism is going to be invalid because it commits the fallacy of illicit minor. Talk about Rule 3. Rule 3, easy to apply. Cannot have two negative premises. Two negative premises prove nothing. That's it, that's the whole rule. So how do you test for it? You go through and you look for an A or an I. One of your premises has to be an A or an I statement, no matter what. You can't prove anything with any mood that begins EE, EO, OE, or OO is automatically going to be invalid. I do that by looking at the mood. You don't even need to tell me the figure. All four figures on any of those, 16 different moods are going to be invalid just by having too much negativity in them. Why can't I prove something with two negative premises? Can I prove a negative premise with two negative premises? Let's talk about that. Why not? Let's think. Here's a sample argument with two true premises and a true conclusion, but structurally it's not valid. I know that automatically because it has two negative premises, but let's reason out why. Why is it the case that I can't use these two things to prove any connection between these? As for distribution, I've got no problem because every single term is distributed in every single claim. I mean, E claims do a lot of distributing, but they're negative. Can somebody think of a way of intuitively explaining this? Why is it that the fact that no women are priests, even if it's true, the fact that no priests are aliens, even if it's true, don't justify me in believing that no women are aliens? Yeah, Sean?
They're two separate groups.
Mm-hmm.
So because women are not priests, that means that they're a separate group.
Right.
And if aliens are a separate group from priests, we know nothing about what the relationship between women and aliens.
Okay, so we're trying to draw a connection between women and aliens, something about their relationship, based upon each of their relationships with this middle term, which is in this case is priests. I just made this up, but I do have a distributed claim about each one of these. I know that these is totally separate. All of these are totally separate from here, and all of these are totally separate from here. Lots of distribution, but it's all giving me claims that are exclusionary, right? About who is excluded from which group. The fact that these are both excluded from this doesn't tell me whether these are exclusive of each other. They could be, the way I've drawn it here, or right, this arrangement is just as consistent with the two premises as the one I just erased. How do I know which one is the case? I don't, and that's precisely why this argument's invalid. These two facts between them do not give me enough information to conclude that third fact as the conclusion. It doesn't validly follow from those two things. I'm trying to approach this first just sort of in a very intuitive way so you can see why it is that negative premises simply don't give me enough. Since they only talk about excluding and not including, they don't give me any strong enough claim to allow me to draw a conclusion about the relationship between S and P. Other thoughts about this or confusions? This is an easy rule to apply because you can recognize two false premises right away, but I'd like you to see sort of structurally why it is the case that no valid conclusion can ever follow from two negative premises. I think, well, if I watered it down, maybe if I said instead of an E, an O, If some women are not aliens, does that still follow? It doesn't even follow there, because I could still draw. I could draw that. Actually, in this case, I don't. Women and aliens could have any conceivable relation. One could include the other or be included by it. They could overlap partially or totally. They could be totally independent, as in fact they are. The point is, the relationship between these two circles out here, I'm not given any sort of determinate guidance on by the premises that I have, provided those premises are merely negative. Okay, I'm hoping to have this a point at which each of you it just sort of clicks. You say, okay, I see it. That's not going to work. Two negative premises don't prove anything. If that doesn't work for you, just memorize that two negative premises never prove anything. That'll do you right until you finally have the moment of insight. The same as it turns out, by the way, this is one of his corollaries. Same thing holds for particulars. No argument can have two particular premises. I'm not going to make that a rule because it follows naturally from the rules we have. Let's talk about rule 4. Yes, sir.
Is there a name for the fallacy for this?
Oh, I'm sorry. No special name for it. It's a fallacy of two negative premises, but it's such a blanket rule that we don't really need a sort of cool name for it. Rules 3 and 4, I don't think have any name. I just call them a Rule 3 violation and a Rule 4 violation. If I can think up an awesome name, I'll start using it. Maybe it'll catch on. But it's been a few thousand years, and maybe we don't have a good name for it yet. Rule 4. Okay. Rule 4, this is maybe the hardest rule to apply, but it is symmetrical, so it has the value that Rule 2 doesn't have. This deals with negativity, and it deals also with connections between premises and conclusions, just like Rule 2. The rule here is that if there is any negativity in the argument at all, it has to occur in the conclusion in one premise. Okay. Can't occur in both premises. I can rule that out by Rule 3. So either I'm going to have all affirmative claims, premise, premise, conclusion, or I'm going to have a single negative premise with a negative conclusion. That sets up more limits on my moods that are possible for valid syllogisms. So I put this here as two if claims. You can just think about applying them. If the conclusion is negative, a premise must be negative, and if a premise is negative, then the conclusion must be negative. Rule here being that you can't conclude a negative from two affirmatives or an affirmative from any negative premise. Why is that the case? No name for this fallacy. Oh, he calls it the fallacy of two negative premises, Rule 3. Why is this the case? Let's take the first side of it. This means that we can't conclude a negative conclusion from two affirmative premises. So I can't have an A-E syllogism, for example, or an A-I-O syllogism. Let's consider the first one. It almost sort of suggests to me right away that there's going to be a problem here, right? If I'm talking about membership of one group in another, membership of another group in another, relating S and P each to a middle term, we'll take an AEE1. That's maybe the most promising. So if all M are P, all priests are men, and also all, oh, what should we add in here? What's our S? Is there any S I can put in here? All, I'll say monks. Sort of weird here, okay? All priests are men, all monks are priests. Suppose that were true. Therefore, no monks are men. Seems almost like the opposite would follow, doesn't it? Right? Actually, I would actually want to conclude an A claim from that. Maybe think about this with some basic diagrams. If all M are P, M is contained entirely inside of P, and we know S is contained entirely inside of M. We're being asked, does this prove that S is excluded from P? In fact, no, quite the opposite. So that's not going to work. An AAE, in this mood at least, is not going to work. A thought? Yes?
It seems that for this rule, You can boil it down to the first two rules of the distribution.
Yeah.
Right. So for our conclusion, we have men is distributed in conclusion, but not in the.
You're right. What I need to do, this should be distributed here, yeah. What I need to do is to think up an example that violates only Rule 4. And maybe I'll bring that to class next time, because we're almost out of time right now. I need to come up with an example here that violates only Rule 4, but not any other rule. Yeah. Other questions, thoughts, comments?
I think there is one.
What is it?
AA04.
Let's try AA04, thank you. Given any mood and figure, I start by writing a conclusion. And then, since I know it's A, I can write, and since I know it's 4, I can place my M's, and that makes it easy to place the P and the S on the first and second lines. You guys should know how to do this. Rule 1, is M distributed at least once while circle all my distributed terms? Right? In A, it's the subject terms. In the O, it's the predicate term. Is M, here's the way I do it. Rule 1, check, M is circled at least once. Rule 2, what's circled in the conclusion? Is it matched in the premise? Yes, it is. Right? Check. Do I have 2 negative premises? No. The mood, I can just tell by looking at the mood. AA, I have 2 affirmative premises in this case. Rule 4 is what I'm testing, so I'm going to hold off on testing that. It's going to turn out, of course, there's a Rule 4 violation here, because I have a negative premise without a negative premise, negative conclusion with a negative premise. What is wrong with this argument? Distributes M. It doesn't try to claim more about P than the premise can justify. Let me try a sort of basic Venn diagram for this and see what it shows. If all P are M, P's inside of M. If all M are S, inside of S, does this prove that some S are not P? Well, in this case it does, because I can put an X here. Is there another way I can draw this diagram which leaves it open, that maybe there are no S outside of P? What would that be?
All 3 circles are the same size.
If they all three are coextensive. If S, M, and P are all exactly coextensive, if they're just 3 names for the same thing, in that case, I don't have any S that are not P. So in that case, this conclusion doesn't validly follow. Even though I have M distributed, I have P distributed, as required by rules 1 and 2. What I have here is 2 claims about inclusion, trying to establish a claim about exclusion. Right? All that these circles show me is what's included in what. It doesn't tell me about what's excluded from what the relative exclusions are. Okay, thank you for coming up with that example. That was something I didn't have prepared. All right, 2 minutes left. Other questions about this? There's actually some very cool stuff. I'll share it with you online and we'll talk through it on Monday. Some very cool stuff about different moods and figures. Using these validity rules, you can discover that there's some rules about this that I'll leave to you. Any second figure syllogism must have a distributed minor term, etc. I'll give you some of those patterns. If we can work through those, it'll give you a deeper idea of why these work. I want to get you applying these and identifying whether a syllogism passes all 4 rules and is therefore valid, or whether it violates 1 or more rules and is therefore invalid. Yeah, Sean?
So for this rule, you can always flow it down to like in math, how you have positive times negative, you always get negative.
Yeah, this is positive and negative. You can't generate a negative with 2 positives in this case. And 2 negatives is ruled out by rule 3. What this means is that in terms of their quality, either you're going to have 3 positives, you have 3 affirmative claims, or you're going to have an affirmative major premise with the other 2 being negative, or you're going to have an affirmative minor premise with the other 2 being negative. Those are your only possible combinations of qualities.